Yo, today I'm going to be breaking down my song All By Myself from the EP of the same name, which is out right now, so you should definitely go stream it after you watch this so I can have money. You can go to this timestamp if you want to see how I made the drop synths, because I know that's what you're here for. I came up with the idea for the song, I think in March. I'm not sure for sure, but it was whenever I was making Defiance, you know, that one song. So I came up with the chord progression and the melody, and the name just kind of went with the feel of the aforementioned chord progression and melody. But anyways, getting into it, I'm going to start off with the intro as per usual. So I've got the chord progression right here, and this is just on a Flex grand piano. I think I've mentioned my piano processing before. It's just kind of making it brighter and mono. And then I have a serum effects, and then the serum effects is just for some wideness. And then I've got an EQ making it a little extra brighter, and a kilohertz compressor just to make sure, you know, it's not too loud. And then I have a couple effects on that. First of all, I have a mid-side EQ, and then I have more EQ shaping, but I've also got this high shelf, which I am decreasing the effect of over time just for the beginning of the intro. So it kind of brightens as we get into the build-up, and then getting into the build-up, I kind of switch up the chord progression to go back to the root note. But I have the top notes of the chord progression playing. It just sounded better than having just the normal chord progression. And then I have some volume stuff going on here. And for this thing right here, I used the same piano, but it was a bit loud in the outro, so I turned the volume down and also put this EQ on it, which is mostly just a high pass. Moving on, I have this synth here, which is just a bit of a counter melody. It's just one sine wave. These are turned down in volume. That's got a distortion and a ton of reverb on it. I used 3x oscillators so I could use these slide notes, which I've been using quite a bit recently. So, and then finally I have this synth playing the melody, which if I turn all these effects off, you might be able to hear this is just the drop synth for the second half of the first drop. You might be able to hear this is just the synth for the second half of the first drop. And I have a couple of effects on that to kind of wash it out, I guess. First of all, I have a reverb, and then this spectral gate, which kind of decreases the quality of the sound. This is it with it on. And then if I take that off, as you can hear, the quality increases dramatically. It's kind of like a low pass, but it's also not a low pass. So I have the cutoff of that decreasing over time so the effect can lessen as we get into the buildup. And then I also have the decay time of the reverb going down because I thought that would be a more natural way to get rid of the reverb, I guess. Until I slowly take out the reverb entirely as we get into the drop itself. Next up, I have a couple pads, which are just playing the chord progression, but you know, this one has a volume knob on it, so I could increase and decrease it. So I can increase and decrease the volume of it. I'm going to take the effects off of that. This has just an EQ increasing some volume on it as well. This pad in particular is just a pulse width with unison on it, and then a saw wave also with unison on it, 1 octave up, and then a triangle wave 2 octaves up, and that's got a low pass and some multi-band compression on it. I have a bunch of reverb on it. This is a delay, a reverb, and a crystallizer going into another reverb. All those are being shaped with an EQ, and then this on the end is just a mid-side EQ, and that's going into an EQ just to take out the high and lows. Once again, I've got this volume automation going up and then down. Then I've got this pad right here, which I'm going to actually have to open another instance of FL Studio to show you. So that pad is just this thing right here. So that pad is just this thing right here. It's a phase plant, and it has a brass stab and a flute, and I think like a guitar string pluck. Those are all cross-faded, and that has some delay and ensemble on it and whatnot. And then I'm once again using this reverb, and that's being parallel processed. So I guess I rendered that out and turned the in knob on this upwards so I could get that, you know, increasing in volume sound. And then I have a final pad here. This one also has a spectral gate on it. I think the effect of that decreases. Yeah, right here. Anyways, I have these 2 bells here that are being distorted. These are going through lane 2 only, which is just a dual delay. And then I have these synths up here, which is just the same wavetable multiplied a couple times over. And I've got one octave down, another 2 octaves down. And those are going through reverb, a high pass, and just reducing the gain a little bit. And then once again, that has a spectral gate on it, a kilohertz compressor to make sure it's not too loud, and then a fruity balance just to control the volume, which this is the automation for the fruity balance, by the way. And then I have a respace here. I have this macro being turned all the way down, which kind of turns it into a pluck because it's on the sustain for the envelope. It's on this distortion as well, I guess. And then that's just following the lowest notes of the chord progression. And then I've got a couple of effects, which are all pretty simple. It's mostly just like white noise and a couple of impacts. And then some rises over here. Over here, just before the drop, I have a couple of pads, which are just kind of dissonant. I like the sound of them. But that brings me to the build-up, which is where the drums come in. First of all, single kick here. These drums don't come in until later, but I have a low pass on this kick that just increases over time. I have a snare whose pitch is shifting upwards. That's paired with this clap here. And another clap, which has a low pass. I'm doing some stuff with the volume, and I think I have a reverb on it as well. And then I have the drop cymbals copy and pasted in there just because it sounded good. And then that has this low pass on it. Finally, for the drums, I have this percussive loop. That has a frequency shifter on it and another low pass. This is coming from an FPC. I just kind of loaded in a couple of sounds. And then finally for the buildup, I kind of cut everything out in this section right here. There was going to be a vocal here, but I couldn't find the right vocal, and of course I can't sing at all, so I put a synth there instead, which looks pretty complicated, I guess. But this is just a couple of synths kind of slammed together. First of all, I think there's the first one I made. This phase plant has just a bunch of vocal chops in it. This phase plant has a couple of vocal sounds in it, a couple of flutes and some bells as well, and that is paired with this serum here, which is just a pretty basic synth patch. Those are going into a delay with the tape all the way up, and then I have the diffusion size and amount all the way up. That's going into a fat rack for some distortion. I'm making it completely mono here. Got a fresh air to increase the high end, and then that's being parallel processed with a kilohertz ensemble and then a mid-side EQ, which is going into another EQ, just the high pass, and then there's this final OTT and high pass at the very end. So that's what I had at first, but I decided it was not enough. So I doubled it up a couple of times with, first of all, this pulse width synth, which instead of using unison to make it sound all wide and whatnot, it's using the chaos knobs from Serum. I learned that from an AU5 tutorial. Then there's also this one right here, which is a bell sound. These are actually pretty easy to make if you just take a sine wave and add a bunch of random harmonics to it. You can get these bell kind of sounds. And I turn that into a pluck and just put some OTT on it, EQ shaping, and then a transient shaper because I wanted this to be the transient of the sound. And then I have this final synth here, which is just a couple of saw waves, one of which is 7 octaves up, and that's got a Combs filter on it, and then some distortion and OTT, and altogether they sound like this. And then every time that plays, I'm specifically shaping the volume how I want it to, and I also have a Valhalla Supermassive on it for some reverb, just whenever it's appropriate. And that's all for the build-up. Anyways, I don't have the drop synths in this project file. As you can see, they're rendered out. So I'm just gonna kind of skip to the break. Right here, I have the pads just restated. So they're just kind of back with none of the low passing kind of effects on them. Same with the respace that I have. I have most of my effects back in some capacity, and then I have this crowd cheering just as an ambient background noise. It just kind of worked. The piano is also back, except here I've taken out pretty much all of the character, I guess, of the chord progression. So it's just kind of single notes, and then that goes back in the build-up. This synth has returned. And then I have these bells. This is a flex tubular bell paired with a serum, which I believe I've done the same thing as before. I think this is the first time I did it where I just added random harmonics to make a bell sound. And then I have that twice over and have one of them 1 octave up. And then finally I have this phase plant, which is pretty much every bell sound I have. That's doing most of the work there. And then that top one is going into this sort of chain because pretty much all the recorded sounds in Flex and some other sample libraries kind of pan to the left and right because I guess that's just how they recorded it. So I have to make it completely mono and then put a Serum Effects with a hyperdimension on it just to make sure the wideness is not coming from either the left or the right anyway. So they're all going into an OTT and then parallel processed with that reverb again. And they're playing that melody. And then over here, I have them stacked up with a harmony. And then in the buildup, they're just playing the main melody. And then they get frequency shifted down in the second half of the buildup. And then once again, I have that lead. And also just before the buildup, I have this piano. Just because it kind of fit well with, you know, the actual piano. And then for the break, I have these pretty wide and reverbed drums. So this is just a kick with reverb on it, and this is a couple of snares and claps kind of layered together that also, once again, have a reverb on it. This volume automation is just to create some extra transients as well. I've got my crash, just kind of at the end there. I've got a rim shot here for the rhythmic character, and then in the second half, I have a shaker loop, if I isolate that real quick. And then the build-up drums, I think, are exactly the same. Yeah. And once again, I have those effects down there. Yeah. You know, you've heard that. And then finally, and then for the outro, I've just got pretty much everything exactly the same. I have the piano, it's back. Same with these couple of synths. And then the drop synth playing the main melody. You know, you've heard that. And everything is pretty much the same as the intro. And then at the halfway mark, I take out the piano. So it's just the pads I had before. And they just kind of ring out until the end. And now, second to last thing, before I get into the drop synths, I got the drop drums, which are fairly simple. It's just kind of the same thing you've heard. I have a kick, which is layered with a snare and a clap. Don't question the name there. Obviously, I have my cymbals. And then at the 1/4 mark of the drop, I change up the drums in favor of this more stomping kick. And then I've made my own percussion because I couldn't find the clap that sounded right. So I have a snare and then these sort of ping sounds, this face punch, which I have high passed and I think frequency shifted a little bit. And then I have a clap and a snare at the very end. Altogether, those sound like this. And that just kind of sounded right. And then over here for the second half of the drop, I have a different kick and a different snare. Same cymbals though. And then at the very end here, I have the break snare. Just for the sake of it ringing out. Coming into the second drop, I of course have a completely different flow for everything. I also have some supporting snares here. And then I'm bringing that shaker loop back in, but other than that, pretty much everything is mostly the same. And then just before the second third of the second drop, I have this ride loop. And then the drums are a little bit different here, where I have these reverse kicks to give it a little bit more impact, I guess. Along with a completely different snare, just because I wanted this section to be heavier. And then for the last third of the second drop, it's just a copy of the second half of the first drop. All right, so starting off with the drop synths, going into the first drop, I have the main synth here. So first of all, I'm going to turn off these effects. These are just the final effects. I have a compressor and a fruity balance, and then this one is just for some, and then this one right here is just a peak that I'm moving around quite a bit. So I'm just going to turn that off real quick. So first of all, I have these two things right here. I'm going to go over this one first. This is a transient layer where I'm using a couple of watery samples. If I turn the sustain all the way up, you'll be able to hear them fully. That's what they sound like, but I'm just using the first kind of click. And then I'm making that completely mono and putting a disperser and transient shaper on that just as a clicky transient thing. And then that's layered with this main bass. which is a couple layers here. These two down here are just the resonator and vocoder parts. So I'm just going to mute those real quick. So this actually consists of 2 layers. So there's another sort of transient layer here, which is just a PU made out of a sine wave. There's a ton of distortion on it. There's full diode 2 distortion on it and a multiband compressor. I have an LFO on the gain of that. There's also a high pass and a hyperdimension to make it wider. That's going into 3 OTTs, high pass, making it brighter as well. And then that's going into the final EQ shaping of that first bass. If I turn that off real quick, we can find the actual bass itself. I have a sharp envelope type LFO on both the coarse pitch and the mix of this distortion, just because I wanted it to have some click to it. That's once again just basically a transient. And then I have this LFO on the wavetable position. I'm pretty sure this is a hyper growl, which is just, as you can see over here, you put unison on a saw wave or something like that and then resample it a couple times. And that's going through a phaser. Once again, distortion for the click here and then a hyperdimension. The phaser is being controlled by this LFO shape here. That movement then gets accentuated later through this peak, and there's a slight notch in there as well, but I'll get to that later. Anyways, that's going through 3 OTTs and a fat rack and then into the semi-final EQ shape with this extra transients here. And then with the other one. And then, of course, that's being layered with the colorized version, I guess, where this is just a resonator. If I just quickly turn on this, this is just a resonator here. Got some EQ shaping on it, and then that's paired with a vocoder, which is just a super saw. Incredibly simple. And then that's also being parallel processed with a reverb into this very final EQ shape, which is paired with the bass itself. And then that's being layered with these chords here, which is just the chaos modulated super saws. And then on top of that is a lead, which is actually 2 leads. First of all, I have the exact same patch I just mentioned, except just playing the lead. And then this other one, which is what it looks like. Square wave with sync 1/2 window, saw wave 1 octave up, and then some noise. And that's going into a hyperdimension and basically an OTT. I'm just going to call this an OTT from now on instead of a multiband compressor because that's easier. And yeah, these are all off, by the way. Altogether, they'll sound like this. And then once again, this phaser is moving up here, as you can see by this automation. And then I also have the movement of those peaks and whatnot being changed here with these 2 automations. This automation on the top is for the actual movement itself. And then this automation on the bottom, if I look at it, it's just for the height of this band, whether it's a peak or a notch. And then that's once again going to a compressor and a frequency balance. I had this bass here originally, but it just didn't sound good enough, so I got rid of it. Anyways, second half of the first drop is this bass here, which is actually incredibly odd, but I'm going to have to decipher it real quick, which is actually a couple of sounds. So it's actually a combination of a couple of sounds. This first one is the main one here. It's just this wavetable, and then I'm kind of plucking it, and I've got this automation actually going upwards on the coarse pitch. That's going into an OTT, and then that's being parallel processed with the 10 dispersers, as I've mentioned many times before, and then just some EQ shaping. That's being paired with a copy of it, except that copy has a saw wave, which is being used later, and also that same sort of transient from before, and then those are being vocoded and resonated. The dry layer doesn't have anything else on it, but for the melodic layer, I've got this peak right here, which I kind of doubled down on later, and then the 10 dispersers from the snap heap, an OTT, a fruity reverb, and this EQ to make it a bit brighter and take out all the low end. And then I've got another layer here, which is just kind of a supersaw layer if I look at it real quick. Yeah, this is literally just a supersaw. And then I have this final layer here, which is also being vocoded and resonated. This is something a bit different. Yeah, this is that one bass from Zenith. I have a tutorial on my channel for it, so you can just look at that. I'll link that in the description. And then that's just as a layer for everything. All those together sound like this. And then as you can see, once again, I'm doubling down on that peak just for the secondary layer. And then over here in this part of the drop, I have this tape stop from this cassette transport at only 50%, just because I wanted this specific sound. And then I have it kind of ringing out. I have these other basses here, just as filler basses, I guess. The first of which is this Vital. It's just an inharmonic stretched wavetable. It's got an OTT, some distortion, and a chorus on it, and then a high pass. Also, for one thing, I wish this chorus, specifically from Vital, there was like a Vital effects, just like Serum effects, because this chorus is actually stupidly good. But anyways, then there's this bass here, which I believe is a bass I made a long time ago. Semi-complicated, but basically what's happening here is I've unisoned and then resampled some saw waves, and then there's the bend minus there as well, just through this macro here, which I'm controlling, as you can see. And that's got a phaser, some hyperdimension, and distortion and OTT on it. And then I have this last bass here, which is a kind of void bass, which I just copied and pasted the other inharmonic stretch bass, except I have it going down this time. And then I have a separate oscillator here just to add some tonality to it. And the main thing that's happening is this down sample that's going into an OTT, and then 3 more OTTs in a fat rack, some hyperdimension, and then just some EQ shaping at the very end. Here you can see the automation for that one bass. And then as a last filler bass, I have this thing here, which is a couple of things, actually. First of all, there's this thing here, which is just a super saw, and it's got some reverb on it that is doubled up with this patch that I've already mentioned with the chaos modulations on it. And then that's also got reverb on it, and then a multiband compressor. And then under that is this bass here, which is this Atlantis wavetable, which I use for growls a lot. And then I've got some modulation on the wavetable position and the bend minus. And then this automation type LFO for the EQ over here. That's got an OTT, a distortion, and then a hyperdimension on it, and that's going then into a fat rack. All of those are going into an OTT, and then just a high pass. And then if we go into the final project file, we can see here I kind of rendered it out and reversed it in some points. I also added some more effects. First of all, there's a reverb on it. This reverb is only playing while the sound is playing. And then I've just got some more mixing from this EQ here. And then I have that parallel processed with a Valhalla Supermassive, which also has a fruity balance on it just to control the volume, and then an EQ. Once again, controlling the volume because I have that down by 6 dB, and I'm high passing it as well. And that's just for some noise. And that all gets cut out here, where I have this little vocal just kind of as a filler. There's a higher and lower layer, and then that's got a supermassive, an OTT, and just a mid-side EQ on it. And then over here, as you might be able to hear, I increased the volume of those leads and did some more processing as well. This growl has now the 3 OTTs and fat rack combination, and then that's pretty much completely separate from these leads up here, which are going into an OTT, and then a fruity reverb, and then some more EQ shaping, just to make them a bit louder. What I've also done is kind of chopped up these basses over here, you know, this one right here, to create a transitionary bass, which also has a pitch bend on it. These are stretched a little bit as well, by the way. And then since I didn't like the first filler growl I made for the first half of the first drop, I decided to create a secondary sound design project file so I could create stuff specifically for that filler area. And here we are. So first of all, I have this growl here, which is very complicated. Let me see if I can go over it here. Okay, it looks like there are 2 layers. There's this main layer down here, which is just this Atlantis wavetable. I'm pretty sure this is just the growl from my growl tutorial, which many of you might have watched. And then that is being layered with just kind of a secondary layer, which you can't actually really hear very well. It doesn't make that much of an effect, but by itself, it sounds like that. This is just kind of that doubled up. And then I have a second oscillator, which is just the same Atlantis wavetable, but with a mirror on it. And that's got distortion on it. That's being parallel processed with just the normal one. And then a vocodex, which is modulator pitch shifting it down by about 600 cents, going into an OTT. That's going into this Morph EQ, which is doing its job with the shift and morph knob. That's then going into a filter, just for more filtering, and then 3 OTTs and a fat rack, and then some EQ shaping. And then those are both going into 3 more OTTs, another fat rack, and then more EQ shaping. And then some of the stuff is being controlled by these automations here. And then I have that rendered out because I wanted the main growl and then this kind of extra sound at the end of it, which I rendered here, as I can show you. So I layer those on top of each other and then put a retune at this specific chord in D, and then a Serum effects at the very end just for some hyperdimension to make it wider. The next one is this bass here, which is semi-complicated, I guess. Let me just go over what's happening here. So this is 2 patches here. if I kind of just isolate them real quick. There's this top one, which is kind of complicated, but it's pretty much just a growl. This saw wave right here is FMing this sine wave. And then there's a kind of higher pitched layer, which is pretty much the same thing, just a whole lot different. And then there's a sub bass. So once again, there's this layer here. And then I have the other one. And together they sound like this. And then the other one as kind of the main, I guess, vowel-y layer. So together with some distortion and kilohertz ensembles, they'll sound like that. And then I have the other one using the exact same patch, except I have an added wavetable. I'm just using kind of one of the wavetables I found within Faceplant. Pretty much the exact same processing beyond that. And then the top one is going straight into this patcher, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the bottom one is going through growl processing, just 3 OTTs, fat rack, hyperdimension. There's going into this here, which is splitting the sub and everything else. The sub is going to a mid-side EQ to make sure it's completely mono. That is then being parallel processed here with this bottom one. Oh, actually, what I've done, I guess, is just take the outputs and split them about. So this is the sub down here, and this is everything else as well. So the sub is going through some distortion, and then I'm boosting the sub bass, and that's going into the final distortion that's being paired up with everything else, which is going through a Morph EQ, which has that morph on it, and then some EQ shaping. And then those are all going into this distortion just ever so slightly. And then on top of that, I have these bells. Once again, I've already explained how to do this. Just put some harmonics in there, right? That has distortion, OTT, and a reverb on it, and it's just a couple of notes. And then there's also the other one, which is once again the exact same thing, just a bunch of random harmonics on top of a sine wave. And that's the exact same patch I just went over, except it doesn't have the distortion on it. So these are just kind of the melodic layers for that. And then that main bass also has a resonator layer on it, so it sounds like this. And then there is finally a reverb, just as a wash. Second to last one is kind of the second rendition of the bass I was trying to make. Initially, I had this. Initially, I had something else, but it just didn't sound good at all, so I deleted it. So there's this main part here. This is a 3X oscillator, or at least it was. Jeez, dude. So this is a couple of stuff here. The main layer is this 3X oscillator, which is just a couple sine waves that are 4 octaves apart. That's going into a distortion, and then 3 OTTs and a fat rack, and then some EQ shaping. And then that's being paired with another one of those. This is just kind of low passed, I guess, because it's being distorted with yet another sine wave. Just to make the entire sound a little bit more growly. That's going into 3 OTTs overall, and then some final EQ shaping. And then I have this here. If you mess with the volume of the higher or low octave one, when the higher octave one is quieter, you get a more growly sound. So I just messed with that a bit. And then I have a couple of extra layers. First of all, I have this resonator layer, whose MIDI is coming from this right here, where you can hear it more clearly. There's this first layer, which is once again the bell sounds, which is, I've already explained that, and that's got some white noise. And then another layer, which is just, I think the same thing, a couple octaves higher with no noise. And then once again with everything else. And then that has a Valhalla Supermassive on it for some reverb swelling. And then, yeah, that's the last bass for that section. I'm pretty sure that's everything for the first drop, so I'm going to see if I can find the stuff for the second drop now. And when he's over here, that's not the only sub I have. I also have this one here. Basically the same thing, except I'm using a square wave here. And I also have a couple of extra ones, specifically this sine wave just at -1 instead of -3. And then this other sine wave at +7 semitones. And that's got some OTT on it. And then all of this, which is splitting the sub. The sub has some distortion on it, and then everything else is going through 3 OTTs and a fat rack, disperser, some EQ shaping, a compressor, and then an ensemble to make it wider. Then I've got the first third of the second drop, which first of all, I'm going to go over these basses here since I render them out later. This is actually pretty simple. I say I'm a liar. First of all, there's this bass here, which is a combination of 2 basses, one of which is a Vital stack, pretty much all the same. They're Atlantis wavetables, and I have a ton of stuff on a ton of envelopes. This envelope is on the pitch, inharmonic stretch, the wavetable, so on and so forth. I have a phaser, which is just kind of phasing around, if you will. This envelope is also on a high pass filter, and then I have OTT, distortion, and then a flanger as well for the envelope. And there are actually 3 of those, all the same effects, just different wavetable once again for here. And then those are all going into 3 OTTs and a fat rec, some EQ shaping, and then hyperdimension. And that is being paired with this other one here, which is basically just a kick drum. And I have some of those prism wavetables from AU5 on there as well. Distortion, OTT, and this is just a transient layer. The dry layer, as you can see here, has some EQ shaping and then a kilohertz compressor on it. And then those are being vocoded and resonated. And they've got some subtle reverb on them, along with a different reverb, which is kind of a reverb swell, as you can see here. And then I've got these filler basses just kind of at the beginning of everything. I'm going to turn my sound chain off really quick. They've actually got quite a bit of stuff on them, but there's this first bass, which is pretty basic. It's just kind of a growl. I've got this envelope on some of the pitch here, and also this right here, just for some movement. I have this LFO on the phaser. It has some distortion and an OTT on it, and it's just a couple of wavetables here. 3 OTTs, fat rack, EQ shaping, hyperdimension, you know, the works. And then I have this extra little bit here, which is just a square wave and some noise, and that's going through a distortion, just for this little beep type sound. And then that has this MIDI out, which is controlling the MIDI for this resonator here, for all these effects. Those are both going into, once again, the resonator, an OTT, some distortion, some EQ shaping, a compressor, and then a fruiter balance just to control the volume. And then there's this little fill here. And then I have this growl, which I went over in my Morph EQ video. So if you want to see, I guess, completely how I made that, you can watch that video. But basically, it's just a couple of growls that are almost all identical, except I'm just using slightly different wavetables. There's this one right here, and that's being paired with another one, which is almost exactly the same, except it doesn't have the mirror effect on it. It's got some bend minus on it. These are Atlantis wavetables, by the way, from, where are those from? From just this right here. That right here is the second one, and I use that a lot. Those are going into this Morph EQ, which is morphing as it should. And then that's being paired with this other one, which is pretty much the exact same thing, except it's not going through the Morph EQ, just as an extra kind of bottom layer. And then those are going to 3 OTTs, fat rec, some more distortion, some EQ shaping, hyperdimension, and then a mid-side EQ right here. And then in this area here, you can see by the original MIDI, which I kind of just copied and pasted in here. Yeah, this right here, there's supposed to be a stutter right here. So I have that in there. If you look at the basses themselves, which is being accomplished by this here, as you can see by this on the volume knob, and this one down here, which is the exact same thing. And then that has a vocoder layer. All of those are then finally going into a kilohertz compressor. And then if we go up here, that bass is being layered with the super saws. Oh, by the way, I put a low pass on that. So what this is just a bunch of different patches in which I'm using 3x oscillator instead of like a serum, for example. And that's going into a hyperdimension, which is being parallel processed with this reverb. And then, as you can see, I have a ton of automations, which are just going into one knob to, once again, make that stutter effect. It didn't work too well because I have the reverb on. As you can see, I have a ton of effects going out, which is just kind of the panning, I think. It's going left and right. And the reason I use 3x oscillator instead of any other synth is so I could use these slide notes, which were exactly what I needed for this sound. And then that has a kilohertz compressor on it, a mid-side EQ, and then a fruity balance just to control the volume a little bit. And that's being layered with this lead up here, which is another 3x oscillator. I have a higher layer, which is just made out of a couple square waves, and then a lower layer, which is almost the exact same patch. And as you can see, I have the fine knob here, which is creating a vibrato effect for the stutter. That's going into a Morph EQ, which is then going through a hyperdimension and some distortion and OTT, and then some final EQ shaping. And then that's going into this EQ, which is boosting it quite a bit and adding some extra high end, which is then going into a delay because I wanted this tape sound. That is then going into a reverb and then a compressor and then a fruity balance at the very end. And also I rendered out 2 different versions of this bass here. This one has the highest lead sound in it. I can't get my line right. You might be able to hear that. It's pretty subtle though. And then moving on to the last part of this drop. And finally, we get on to the heavier drop. First of all, I'm going to go over the filler layers. This one is back. It's just playing something a little bit different, and I've kind of deleted or muted the growl layer because it's playing at the same time as this growl, which I also went over in the Morph EQ video, but I guess I'll go over it a little bit here. It is once again just these Atlantis wavetables. It's pretty much the exact same as the other bass I was talking about. I have a phaser on this top one here. Same with this one, I guess, but this one also has distortion on it, and it's mirrored instead of just the bend minus. That's then going into this EQ here, which is then going into this here, where I'm using the band filter, or the band pass filter, and that's going into a hyperdimension, and then that is all going into the 3 OTTs, a fat rack, another OTT, some EQ shaping, and then a mid-side EQ at the very end, and the morph path is being controlled by this automation clip here. I also have some smaller filler basses. I've got this one here, which is just a square wave with an envelope on the master tune, and this envelope is on this high pass here. That's going into, there's also a distortion on it as well. That's going into an OTT, a hyperdimension with some reverb, and then a high pass. And there's also this one here, which is just the modern talking wavetable, a hyperdimension, 3 OTTs, a fat rack, and some final EQ shaping. And then going over the main bass. This one actually sounded like trash in the very beginning, but I decided to just kind of roll with it, and it ended up sounding pretty good. So first of all, you have the bottom layer. I could not tell you where this wavetable came from, but it sure is here. So first of all, I have this envelope on everything that I could have it on, literally everything. There's EQ for filtering, and then a phaser and some distortion on that. And that's then going through 3 OTTs and a fat rack, some EQ shaping, and then a hyperdimension, I would assume. Yep, just as predicted. And that's just the dry layer, which is then going through some further processing over here with this vocodex, just to get this lower layer, because I have the modulator pitch shift all the way down, and then some final EQ shaping on that one. And then that's going into the final processing, which is just a compressor. And then I have the melodic layer, which is doing the overwhelming majority of the work. So first of all, I'm going to go over the carrier for this vocodex. It's more 3X oscillators, which is just super saws going into a couple dispersers, some OTT, and some EQ shaping, which I think that's where most of the character of the sound comes from. And then once again, that's being vocoded with the main bass. There's also a resonator layer. And then the overall melodic layer has OTT, EQ shaping, and then a delay on it just to make it a bit wider. And add some little bit of reverb. And then over here at the very end, I have the portamento for the resonator turned all the way up. And this is the reason I used those 3X oscillators, so I could do the slide notes once again. And then that is being layered with this lead sound here, which is the exact same thing as the carrier synth, except I'm using serums. I'm pretty sure I made it with the serums first and then kind of replaced them with 3X oscillators so I could do those slide notes. And then this one specifically is going into an OTT and a delay. Delay for the same reason as before. And then I have a very final layer here, just as the main transient, which is incredibly simple. I have a kick noise, which is supposed to be used for kicks, but you know, whatever. And I'm effectively creating a kick here with this sine wave. And I've layered that with a saw wave, and that's got distortion and compression on it, multi-band compression, I should say. And yeah, altogether those sound like this. Which honestly goes pretty crazy in my opinion. But yeah, looking over here in the final project file, it looks like that's it. I just have everything rendered out here, so I'm going to go over the mastering real quick. So yeah, I just have, the song rendered out, and then that is going into 3 OTTs and a fat rack. No, I'm kidding. It's going into an Ozone 9, which is just some EQing and some limiting at the very end. This band is just to look at it, and that is all. Stream this right now. Link in description. That's all for now. Goodbye. Dude, this is just for the drop synths of the recording that took 1 hour and 6 minutes. I don't get paid enough for this shit.